Hello, I am John Ricciuti, your host today for MainlineTV.org. Our person of interest today is Gordon Smith. Gordon is the son of one of the famed Tuskegee Airmen, Luther Smith. Gordon speaks nationally about the legendary guardian angels of the sky and his father, who escorted bombing missions over occupied Europe during World War II. We are proud to have Gordon as our guest today. Hello, Gordon, and thank you for coming to Mainline TV to do an interview with us.
Good morning, John. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and privilege to speak about the legendary Tuskegee Airmen, so I'm pleased to be with you today.
So my question to you, as the son of a World War II veteran, when did you become interested in your dad as a World War II veteran, and then, of course, the famed Tuskegee Airmen?
So I don't remember a specific time or date when I first started to have an interest. And as you'll learn as we speak about today, my father was severely injured on his last mission. So he was disabled from that point on.
How many missions did your dad fly?
So Dad flew 133 combat missions. And so on his final mission, which was Friday, October 13th, 1944, plane caught on fire and he had to bail out. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But he was severely disabled as a result of that. And so I knew from the time I was born that something had happened because due to the injuries that he sustained, his right leg was actually 6 inches shorter than his left leg. So physically I could see, well, something had happened. What happened? So I knew from the time I was a child that something had happened. But Dad never spoke about it. And what little I knew about Dad being in an airplane, was on fire, parachuting as a small kid, was pretty terrifying. So the fact that he didn't talk about it and the fact that it seemed kind of terrifying, really didn't speak about it at all. Certainly while I was, say, at elementary school age. By the time I got to high school, I think I probably started to ask maybe a little bit more questions, but still didn't know a great deal. And it really wasn't until the last 10 years of his life, and Dad lived till 2009, and he was 89 when he passed away. It's really the last 10 years of his life that I probably learned about 80% of what I learned about my father while he was alive. And interesting, John, that 80% of what I learned while he was alive probably only represents about 40% of what I know today, just because he just didn't speak that much. And since he's passed away, and with the advent of the internet and the ability to do a lot of research, that I've learned so many things about what the Tuskegee Airmen were able to accomplish and my father's role with that group.
So what did he tell you? He had to overcome obstacles to become a Tuskegee Airman.
Yeah, he didn't talk so much about the challenges that African Americans in general had to face. That I pretty much learned on my own. But he talked about how difficult the training was at Tuskegee, where they trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. He actually had his pilot's license before the war. He was one of the few African-American licensed pilots before the war. So he knew how to fly, but as he always said, flying as a civilian and flying as a U.S. military aviator and flying in formation, whole different ballgame. And so he always thought that was a big hurdle that he had to overcome. He talked a little bit about just the joy of flying the P-51 Mustang, the premier fighter of its era and arguably the finest turbo piston plane ever designed. And he talked about just what a magnificent plane that was to fly. So he spoke a little bit about that. He would talk about the length of the missions. When they would go on an escort mission, those missions would last 6 to 8 hours. And he would talk about that was a long day, flying those missions. And that when they would land, and frequently they were running very, very low on fuel when they would land. And he would say it was always very, very stressful because they had to fly over the Adriatic Sea to get back to where they were based in Ramitelli, Italy. And so those last 50 miles or so coming over the sea and then having to land. And he said many, many times they would come in and land and the plane in front of them might be out of fuel and literally stop on the runway. And so they had the challenge of trying to land a plane with another plane right in front of them on the runway, and accidents did happen because simply the planes didn't have any more fuel in them. There's no place for the pilots to go because they were right on the border of the sea. So he talked about that, and he would talk about when they finished the mission, oftentimes there were Red Cross volunteers that were there, And they would meet the pilots, and they'd have donuts and cookies for the pilots. And then the pilots would go, after they would provide a briefing of their mission, they would go right out to the sea and just jump into the sea to relax. So he would talk about those types of experiences. But his last mission, I probably didn't know any details till he was maybe 80 years old. And he was originally from Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa, and around 2000 or so.
Was he a college graduate?
He was. At the time, he had completed 2 years of college at the University of Iowa before the war. And then when the war broke out, that's when he enlisted. And then he went back to the University of Iowa after the war.
He enlisted in the Army?
So as you know, the Air Force was part of the Army at the time. It was the United States Army Air Corps. So when it had been determined that the U.S. military would allow African Americans to apply, become U.S. military aviators. So this was in the beginning of 1942. He applied, and he was accepted into the program in August of 1942.
Did your father ever tell you that he had any shoot downs or kills?
Sure. My father destroyed 2 airplanes in the air and destroyed another 10 on the ground. And so he did talk about both of those experiences. So the very first plane that he shot down was on July 17th, 1944, and he was flying an escort mission over Avignon, France. And the bomber group that he was escorting was attacked by German Me-109 fighters. And so, which was Germany's premier fighter at the time. And so as the German fighters came in, my father lined up on one German plane, Me-109, and just before he pulled the trigger, he was actually close enough to the plane, the German plane. He was able to look into the cockpit, and he could see that the German pilot did not have on his face mask, he didn't have on his goggles. And so my dad could clearly see his face, and Dad remarked to himself, wow, this pilot is really young. Really young. I didn't come over here to shoot kids. And just in that mere 1 second of this thought process going through his mind, he overflew the Me-109. And now the Me-109 was on his tail. And so that was quite a predicament. But because of his superior skill as a pilot, because of the superior training he had received, because of the superior skill of the P-51 Mustang, he was able to maneuver around, get back on the tail of the German Me-109, and then he shot it down. And he said that was quite a lesson, because this isn't training anymore. This is war. You're over here to kill or to be killed.
So he was distracted by the fact that he was A, without any gear on, and B, that he was a kid.
Just that mere 1 second of looking at who the opponent was, the enemy, and realizing this young fellow, he's really young. I'm going to kill this young guy. And when you're flying at 400 miles an hour, you move quickly. In just that 1 second, he now had overflown the German fighter, and that German fighter now was on his tail.
Yeah. Did your father ever think that today might be the last day?
I think that's not an attitude that pilots have. They are all thinking that, I'm going to live forever. And you probably saw the movie Top Gun, and you saw Tom Cruise and that type A attitude and mentality that fighter pilots all shared. So you would practically never see a fighter pilot thinking, this could be my last day. They were very, very well aware of the dangers of what they were embarking on each day. They had a long way to go. They had the worries about running out of ammunition. I mean, they had 3 50 caliber machine guns under each wing, but the total firing time of those 6 guns is only 15 seconds. So if you're heavily engaged with the enemy, 15 seconds goes very quickly. So they were worried about running out of ammunition. They were always worried about engine problems. That was constant concern. They only have one engine. One engine's got to take them 123 miles over the Adriatic. They got to ascend to 13,000 feet just to get over the Alps on the other side of the Adriatic, fly to Germany, engage the enemy, turn around, get back over the Alps, fly over the sea, and land. That's a lot with one engine. And so the engines malfunctioned regularly. And kind of a little known fact.
Who made those engines?
So the engines, the P-51 Mustang was manufactured by the North American Aviation Company. And the engines originally were called Allison engines And then they decided the Allison engines didn't have sufficient turbocharge to them to fly at high altitudes. And so the engines were replaced with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. So the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was 1,650 horsepower. It was magnificent. And Packard was the one that actually designed and retrofitted the Rolls-Royce engine to fit into the North American manufacturing company, P-51 Mustang. And so the combination was superior. And as I said earlier, the P-51 Mustang is pretty much considered the finest turbo piston plane ever designed. So here's kind of a prototype of what's called a P-51D model. So you'll notice the canopy, which is what was referred to as a bubble top canopy. So this was the latest version, the last version that was produced during World War II. At the time that the P-51 Mustang was being used by the Tuskegee Airmen in the beginning of 1944, they did not have brand new P-51 Mustangs. They were getting secondhand planes that had been used by the other white fighter groups in Europe. And so as these planes were arriving in Ramitelli, where the 332nd was stationed, they were what was called B and C models. So they had what was called a shellback canopy. So they didn't have this bubble glass. It was solid metal canopy. So they didn't have the visibility that you have here. And the planes all had different markings on them. And so they wanted something that was going to be their own. And so the only thing they had in sufficient abundance at their base in Ramitelli was red paint. Red paint. Okay. So what they did is they actually painted the tails of their planes red. So as you can see, that red tail is fairly distinctive. And so if the full group was flying, that's 64 planes. If you see 64 red-tailed Mustangs, that's going to make a mental impression upon you, like, wow, these red-tailed Mustangs. And as I was saying to you earlier, John, the bombers would take off before the fighters, and they would meet at what was called the rendezvous point. And so what would happen is the fighters would typically be there waiting for the bombers to come in because the fighters flew faster. And whenever the 332nd was providing escort, the bomber groups began to realize, every time we get escorted by the 332nd, they're always there. They're waiting for us at the rendezvous point. Unlike some of the other white fighter groups that would be late or never even showed up, the Red Tails were always there. And when the Red Tails were given the assignment of fighting fighter escort, their leader, whose name was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, he had graduated from West Point in 1936, and he was the first African-American to graduate from West Point during the 20th century. While he was at West Point, he was given the silent treatment, which meant he had to room by himself, and he had to eat by himself. And the only time during the 4 years that he was at West Point anyone ever spoke to him was to issue a command. And he finished in the top 20% of his class. And when you finish that high, you typically are allowed to go wherever you want. He wanted to go into the Army Air Corps, and he was not allowed to because he was an African American. And when he got the chance to go in 1941, he was in the very first class. And so he was selected as the leader, first the 99 Squadron, and then the full fighter group, which consisted of 4 squadrons. So when they were given the responsibility of flying fighter escort, Davis called all the pilots together and said, men, our job is to stay with the bombers. If any pilot ever leaves formation to chase after a German fighter just to improve his record of kills, you will be court-martialed. Our job is to stay with the bombers. And so the pilots were all in awe of Davis. Again, he was a West Point graduate. He was tall. He walked with a ramrod straight back. And very impressive leader. And no one ever disobeyed that order. And that was one of the reasons why they were so successful, because they were highly, highly disciplined. While they were going through training, the failure rate for the African Americans was 80%.
80?
The failure rate for white aviation cadets was only 20%. So for the government, this was an experiment. They didn't really want the African Americans to be there. So they were failing, or what was called in the military, washing out the African American candidates left and right. And the instructors would even tell them that. They would show up and they would say, look to your left, look to your right. If you are lucky enough to make it through this program, the person on your left and the person on your right will not make it through. So they knew from the very beginning. Think about how hard it is just going through training and learning how to fly an airplane, learning how to fly a fighter airplane. And then despite no matter what you're doing, 4 out of 5 of you aren't going to make it through.
Why?
It's the Americans and the military government simply did not believe that African Americans had either the skill or the intelligence or the courage to fly airplanes, handle sophisticated military equipment. And interesting, John, in 1925, the U.S. War Department, which was the predecessor of the Pentagon, produced a paper called The Use of Negro Manpower in War. And in this so-called study, they said that African Americans had a brain that was 10 ounces smaller than that of whites, and that they lacked the courage and the skill necessary to handle advanced military equipment. So this was the formal policy of the government and the military prior to the war. And so this was the attitude that the African Americans had to overcome. So that's what they were facing.
That's stunning. That really is stunning. Did your dad know that?
Oh yeah. I mean, they were all very well aware of it because, again, before the war, there was just no form or vehicle under which African Americans could enter into the military as military aviators. As you were probably aware, the military was segregated prior to World War II, which is in and of itself pretty amazing, because if you go back in history, you go back as early as the Revolutionary War, there were 5,000 African Americans that fought for the Continental Army.
Yes.
And even George Washington, slave-owning George Washington, admitted the valuable role that African Americans played in our nation's original war against the British. Then you go 60 years later to the Civil War. Now, there were 160,000 African Americans that served in the Union Army. There were 40,000 African Americans that served in the Navy. So that's 200,000 sailors and soldiers that fought for the Union. Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding officer of all Union forces, said there's no way the Union Army would have been successful in defeating the Confederacy without the role of the African Americans. Then you go another 60 years or so to World War I. There were 350,000 African Americans that fought for the U.S. Army in World War I. 171 of them earned the Legion of Honor from France, the highest military award that was provided. And yet, going into World War II, the American forces were segregated, and African Americans weren't even allowed to apply to become U.S. military aviators. Well, as you probably know, just before the start of World War II, the U.S. government was aware that it's entirely likely the U.S. could get drawn into war, and that our aviation capabilities from a military perspective were very, very weak. And so what was developed was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program. And so that was open to anyone regardless of race. And the whole idea was the government would provide rudimentary flying training, so they'd have a reservoir of pilots that they might be able to draw on should the U.S. get drawn into war. And so African Americans would apply to participate in the Civilian Pilot Training Program. My father was one of them. And so you probably had at least 150, maybe 200 African Americans that had completed the Civilian Pilot Training Program at the start of the war. So it was kind of complete hypocrisy to say, well, African Americans can't fly when the government's paying and showing that, here's at least a couple hundred who've already been able to achieve their license. And so the black media and civil rights groups and black churches, et cetera, were putting a lot of pressure on the federal administration and President Roosevelt to say, look, this doesn't make any sense. We have a need for pilots. You're not allowing the entire race of African Americans to even apply. It doesn't make any sense. Well, at the same time, you've got a government program which allows them to go through and they're getting licenses. This doesn't make any sense. So, as you know, 1940 was an election year. And so Roosevelt said, okay, I'm going to allow African Americans to apply to become U.S. military aviators.
Right, okay.
But as 1940 went on, nothing had changed. And so in January of 1941, Yancey Williams, who was a graduate of Howard University, engineering graduate, who had gone through the Civilian Pilot Training Program, sued the government. And the next day, the government announced, okay, we're going to formally create one squadron. It was designated the 99th Pursuit Squadron. It's going to have their training at Tuskegee, Alabama, which was a historic black college where they already had a civilian pilot training program. And so that's where the African Americans would go through their training. And so African Americans at that point were allowed to apply. But as I was saying earlier, the washout rate was close to 80%.
Because they would just be failed automatically, just to fail them for no particular, you failed.
The government just didn't think this was going to be successful. They didn't really want them there to begin with. And so they were washing them out. And so all the pilots, all the cadets knew going in there that this was what they were facing. And so in my father's case, he grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. He was one of 9 kids, and his background and his interest in aviation you might find interesting. At the age of 7, that was when Charles Lindbergh made a historic transatlantic flight. And so my dad was aware of it. He'd heard about it on the radio, and he thought, oh, this is interesting. Now, again, he's in Iowa, so the concept of the Atlantic Ocean and flying an airplane was quite novel, to say the least. And he was really quite impressed by that. And he actually went into school the next day, 2nd grade. He drew an airplane, and he said to his teacher, one day I'm going to be able to fly an airplane. I'm going to fly my family to Africa. And the teacher said, oh, Luther, that's interesting. And then 5 years later, at the age of 13, he and one of his 3 brothers on a Sunday in August were walking in a field. And this is Des Moines, Iowa, 1933. And they found a $5 bill. And my dad talked to his brother, whose name was Howard, into saying, hey, let's take that $5 bill and go to the airport and get an airplane ticket. And so they walked 5 miles to the Des Moines airport, and they bought an airplane ticket. Now, the cost of the ticket was $5. That's all they had. But the pilot took a real interest, these 2 little black boys who wanted to go up in the airplane. He said, yeah, kids, come on in. But they had only 1 ticket, so my father sat in the seat, and his brother Howard had to sit in his lap, and up they went. And that changed my father's life forever. Because father's life forever. Because at that point, that was the first time they'd never even seen an airplane before up close. And now they were actually in an airplane. They went up and they flew. And oh my goodness, that just changed Dad's life. And so when they landed, and the 2 of them went home, and they were sharing with their parents what a great time it was. And then my dad would continue to walk to the airport. And the crew, the various ground crew and pilots began to notice him as the only black kid who was there. And they would say, kid, would you like to get a job here? And he would say, I'm only 13 years old. I said, doesn't matter, you can help clean the hangars, and you can wash the windshields of the plane, et cetera. He says, well, I have to ask my parents. And he asked his parents, and they said, sure, Luther, if this is what you want to do, go for it. And so he would walk 5 miles every day to the airport. And at first he was doing simple things, as I said, like sweeping the hangars. But then as time went on, they were giving him increasing responsibilities, and he was beginning to work on the engines, et cetera, and just totally fascinated. And
these are probably double-wing planes.
Yeah. And at the time, the U.S. commercial airlines were providing the mail service. They were carrying the mail. And then they went on strike. They wanted more money. And originally the government wasn't going to pay them more money. So the mail had to be delivered by the U.S. military. And so now you had military pilots that were flying in, delivering the mail. And so my father was able to see these pilots, listen to them. And as they were talking about things like meteorology and thermodynamics and aerodynamics, this was all incredibly fascinating to my father. And he said to himself, I want to be a U.S. military aviator, because these guys, they looked so dashing and heroic. And to my father, they were flying in from faraway places like Kansas City, and St. Louis, and Milwaukee, and Chicago, which to a kid in Des Moines seemed like a long way away. And the fact that they were flying in all kinds of weather conditions, they just seemed like real heroes to him. And so he said to himself, I would like to become a U.S. military aviator. But as I said earlier, there was no forum, there was no vehicle under which African Americans could become U.S. military aviators. So it was just something he kept to himself. And when he graduated from high school in 1938 in Des Moines, he applied at the University of Iowa in the School of Engineering. My dad had no interest in engineering, but he thought, well, if I get an engineering degree, this may help me become a U.S. military aviator. And so he had 2 years of engineering before the war. And then the war broke out, as I said earlier. He applied, and he was accepted because he had a license. He'd gone through the civilian pilot training program, which in and of itself is another interesting story, John. When he went through the civilian pilot training program in Des Moines, at the particular flying school where it was held in Des Moines at the same airport, when he went to take the final test, the instructor failed him. Now, the owner of the flying school, his name was Howard Gregory. Mr. Gregory had seen my dad there, like every week for the prior 7, 8 years. And he said, there's no way that Luther Smith would have failed. So he arranged for another instructor pilot to provide the test. And of course, Dad passed. But I share that story because it kind of gives you an idea. Now, there was very little interest in having African Americans becoming licensed pilots. And there's someone who had been at the airport every week for 7, 8 years. Originally, there was someone who didn't want him to become. So just getting through the training was a tremendous source of accomplishment that each of them had. And so they developed tremendous cohesiveness just by going through the training, going through that environment in Tuskegee Airmen. Then when they originally deployed, and so the 99th, which was that first squadron, and I said that Davis...
From Tuskegee, Alabama to where, England?
The first class that finished was in the spring of 1943, actually 1942. And they had to wait an entire year, John, to deploy because there were no white fighter groups that wanted them to be part of their group. And so when they finally deployed in the spring of 1943, they weren't even allowed to be at the same base as the group that they were attached to, not assigned. It was they were determined that they would be attached and not assigned. So they had to fly into the base to find out what the mission was. And originally they were told, well, you just keep up. That was their assignment, just keep up. And so there were a lot of folks in the military, to your point, who didn't want them there. And they would say, well, look, this black fighter group, the 99th, they're not doing anything. And so Davis actually got called back to the U.S. and had to go before a board of senior military officers to defend what they were doing. He's saying, we're doing the best you can. We're not even at the same base. Our assignments are just to keep up. And so Colonel Spatz, who was head of the 12th Air Force at the time, recommended that they continued, and Hap Arnold, who was head of the Air Force, agreed. And so the so-called experiment was allowed to continue. But from the very beginning, it was very clear. Everything was very clear that this was an experiment. They didn't really want them there. And so during 1943, there was a sufficient number of African Americans who had gone through the training, who had got their coveted silver wings of a U.S. military aviator. They could put together 3 more squadrons. So those 3 more squadrons were identified as the 100th, the 301st, and 302nd. So in January, they departed to England, to Europe, and to share a story. My father, so they left from Camp Patrick Henry in Hampton Roads, Virginia. That's where their point of disembarkation was, to Europe. And on Christmas Eve, my father and several other pilots went to a movie theater. And the owner, this is Hampton Roads, Virginia. And the owner of the movie theater would not allow them in. Now think about this. These guys were officers, United States Army Air Corps. They all had some form of college education, at least 2 years. They were U.S. military aviators. Not only U.S. military aviators, they were fighter pilots. Now that's like being an astronaut today. Right. And on Christmas Eve, before they're off to go defend America in the war, the owner of the movie theater would not allow them in. So again, I share this example to kind of give you an idea of the hurdles that these guys were facing from the very beginning. And then when they arrived in Naples, Italy, is where their initial assignment was, and they were flying.
Did they fly that plane over?
No, they were on boats.
On an aircraft
No, they were on boats.
Oh, okay.
They were just on troop carriers. It took them a month to go across
the Atlantic.
planes
on the...
Yeah, so you'd have a whole flotilla of folks that were escorting them over, and they originally they went first to Africa, and then to Sicily, and then to Naples. So in February of 1944, they started to fly missions. And beginning, they were just flying what was called harbor patrol, protecting the Anzio beachhead. And they never even saw a German plane. My dad says for several missions, never even saw a German plane. They were flying the P-39 Air Cobra, which was an obsolete airplane, to say the least, and definitely lacked capability of taking on a German top fighter. And so that was their original assignment. So you had those 3 squadrons in Naples. You had the 99th that was flying out of North Africa. So there wasn't a lot that was going on of significance. And so a lot of folks were saying, see, what a waste of taxpayer money. They're not doing anything. And as I was saying, relating to you earlier, the U.S. was flying daylight bombing raids,
Right.
taking on heavy casualties. And so a new Air Force group was put together, the 15th Air Force Group, which was commanded by General Nathan Twining. And Twining summoned Davis and said, I need fighter escorts for my new Air Force group. Are your boys up to flying fighter escort? And Davis famously responded, my men, sir, are ready for this. And it was that point, John, that everything changed. For the first time, African Americans were going to be given a frontline, strategic, tactical responsibility, escorting the U.S. bombers from Italy to Germany and back. And so this was a whole new ballgame. And so the pilots were incredibly excited, incredibly motivated, because now they were being given a frontline responsibility. And so they took very seriously what they were doing. And as I said, the pilots, the 1 out of every 5 that had made it through the training at Tuskegee, they were all exceptional pilots. And so you had this highly motivated, well-trained, highly disciplined unit. And so they brought the 4 black squadrons together to form this group. As I said earlier, it was designated the 332nd Fighter Group. And in the beginning, the bomber crews didn't know that these fellows were African Americans. And so all they saw these red-tailed Mustangs, and they began to realize, every time we get escorted by these red-tailed Mustangs, they're on time, they're at the rendezvous point, they stay with us. When the Germans attack us, these guys are phenomenal pilots, they're shooting the German planes down, and they safely escort us back. Who are these guys? And then early on, there were some occasions when the U.S. bombers returning to their bases in Italy would have engine problems, et cetera, and they would actually land on the airfield where the 332nd was stationed. And the crews and the pilots would get out and they would see everyone on this base is black. The ground crew's black, security black, pilots are black. We had no idea these guys were black. And so, as you may know, after roughly every 14 missions or so, a pilot was allowed to go on rest and rehabilitation. It was called R&R. And so while they were on R&R, the white bomber crews would see these black pilots. They'd had the silver military wings and go, you guys are part of the red tail unit. We love being escorted by you. And they start buying them drinks and buying them dinner. So now you had some integration starting to take place. Yeah. And not only camaraderie, but respect, because the white bomber crews knew what phenomenal pilots they were. And as you may know, the pilots could put the names of their wives or their girlfriends on the front of the plane. And so Colonel Davis put on the front of his plane by request, because the white bomber crews didn't want to go on a mission unless they were going to get escorted by the 332nd.
Oh, really?
And so there were only the 332nd flew 179 escort missions between June of 1944 and the end of the war in May of 1945. And of those 179 missions, there were only 7 missions in which a U.S. bomber was lost to a German fighter. Only 7. So the next lowest total of any fighter escort group in all of World War II was 47. So they have 1/7 the losses of any other fighter group in all of World War II. And so this is how the legend began to grow. And so when you think about this incredible arc that they went through, nobody wanted them in the beginning. They had all these challenges and obstacles to go through, just becoming U.S. military aviators, going through the training where 4 out of every 5 were being failed. They get to Germany, they're given secondhand planes. Beginning, they're told you're not going to have any assignment to show up. And then at the end of the war, the U.S. bomber crews didn't want to go on a mission without them. And they had this camaraderie and cohesiveness that had developed. And so you could no longer say blacks can't handle advanced technical equipment, blacks can't be great aviators. They shattered all of that myth. And so that's how the legend grew. And they paid a heavy price for this. And the numbers are kind of staggering. There were 5,200 African American aviation candidates who went to Tuskegee. Of them, only 992 actually got their wings. Of those 992, 355 actually deployed and fought in Italy. Of those 355, 81 were killed, in combat, so that's almost a third. 33 were captured as prisoners of war. So they paid a heavy, heavy price. And as you may or may not be aware, a tour of duty for a fighter pilot during World War II was 50 missions. And after 50 missions, you got to go home. As you had asked me earlier, how many missions my father flew, he flew 133. So one of the reasons why he flew so many missions was that they were not replacing the black pilots. They had to keep flying. And so when you think about that, that mental strain of having to continue to fly and fly and fly. And on my father's last mission, which I said earlier, was on Friday, October 13th, 1944. And so the 332nd that day, their mission was to escort the bombers from the bomb site back to where they would be safe. Because the P-51 lacked the ability to escort the bombers to Germany, over the target, and back. So what would happen is a squadron or a fighter group would be given one of three responsibilities. Either escort the bombers to what was called the initiation point, or the IP as it was referred to, or they would, and it was also called penetration escort, or they would be assigned to escort the bombers over the target, or they would have target withdrawal. And so on this particular mission in October 13th of 1944, the 332nd was flying target withdrawal. And so it was to Blackhammer, Germany, which is a long, long mission from Ramitelli, Italy. And so they picked up the bombers, so to speak, as they got over the target, and then escorted them back to where they would be safe and they would no longer be attacked by the German fighters. And so once they reached that point, then often their responsibility would be to go after what was called targets of opportunity. And so on this particular mission, the 302nd, which was my father's squadron, they decided they were going to go to Budapest, Hungary. There were 3 airports in Budapest. And so they said, okay, we're going to attack those 3 airports in Budapest. And so the 302nd, this would have been 16 planes in the squadron, headed to Budapest. And as they lined up on the first airport, that lead plane was shot out of the sky. So they knew the Germans were there. This was called a hot zone. There was going to be a lot of activity. And so as they swooped down, and what would happen oftentimes, so then you got 16 planes, they would break off into groups of 4. Those were called elements. And you'd have an element leader, and then you'd have a deputy element leader. Now these guys were all the same age, same level of experience, but each mission they would alternate in terms of who would be the flight leader, who would be the deputy flight leader, and who would be the wingman of each of those 2. And so on this particular mission, my father was the deputy flight leader. So there were his 4 planes in the element, and they headed down to one of the airports. And my dad could see that there were 2 German bombers on the runway. And so he said, okay, I'm going after those 2 German bombers. Now, it's very difficult to destroy a plane that's sitting on the runway unless it had any fuel in it, because the whole point was you want to hit the fuel tank explodes, blows up the airplane. There's no fuel in it. Just the 50 caliber bullet alone isn't necessarily going to destroy a great big German bomber. So Dad lines up on these 2 Henkel 111 bombers. And as he's firing into the first one, it blows up. And Dad's thinking, fantastic, it's got fuel in it. And so he comes wheeling around to go back to the base the second time. Now, you never want to go back to the same target twice because the folks are going to be waiting for you. And so Dad had to fly very low to the ground because these 2 German bombers are actually underneath a utility line. And so Dad was flying no more than 8 feet off the ground. And as he lined up on the second bomber, he fired into it and it blew up. And so now he's destroyed these two German bombers, which is very significant. And as he started to pull away from the second bomber that he had destroyed, he's looking outside his wing, and he could see tracer bullets hitting the ground right beyond the wing. He's only 8 feet off the ground. Now, as you may know, in a 50 caliber machine gun, 1 out of every 10 bullets is a tracer bullet,
right,
which means it's marked with phosphorus so that the gunner can see when a bullet hits the ground where his bullets are hitting. So Dad is seeing a number of tracer bullets, and he's only seeing 1 out of every 10 bullets to give you an idea how much fire was around him. And he pulled away and says, boy, that was a close call. And so he pulled back up to altitude and thinking, okay, fellas, let's go home. We're running out of fuel here. And the element leader, whose name was Lee Archer, and his wingman, Wendell Pruitt, they decided they wanted to keep attacking. And so they flew to a freight yard, a nearby freight yard. And they made 7 passes down on this freight yard trying to destroy the trains that were there. And Archer said to my dad, let's go. And Dad's like, no way. I don't have enough fuel to be making these continued passes. And so they made these 7 passes, and my father and his wingman, Chubby Green, were still circling by. And as each minute went by, my dad's getting increasingly infuriated because we don't have the fuel for this. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And finally, Archer and his wingman pulled up, and Dad's singing, finally, all right, let's head for home. And the next thing he knows, he looks over his shoulder, and his wingman, Chubby Green, had peeled off and now was headed down to strafe, which means to attack targets on the ground, which was a complete act of insubordination because Chubby Green was my father's wingman. My father was superior in rank for this particular mission. And so for him to peel off on its own was a complete act of insubordination. But again, as I had referenced earlier about these guys being thinking they're going to live forever. They're 23 years old. They're hotshot fighter pilots.
They're bulletproof.
Yeah. So the military protocol was you can't leave your wingman. And so Chubby Green goes down. My dad has to follow. And Dad's saying to himself, I'm going to see that Lieutenant Green is brought up on charges when we get back because this was a complete act of insubordination. We don't have the fuel to do this. So Dad follows them down. They're going over a rail yard, and he sees a line of rail cars. And Dad's thinking, okay, I've got a few seconds of ammunition left. Let me just unload on what I have, and then that's it. I'm going to pull up the altitude and go back home. And so he lines up on a line of cars, rail cars, and he starts to fire into them. And the next thing he knows, there's this huge explosion. And he's flying 400 miles an hour, and this huge explosion is right in front of him. He can't fly to the left or right or above it. He's got to go right through the explosion that he created. And he flies through it. Now the plane is severely damaged. The tail is damaged. The cockpit's all blackened out. And the other pilots are saying, Smith, what happened? What happened? And he said, I don't know. And he said to Green, pull up next to me. My cockpit is blackened out. I can't see out. And so Green pulls up next to him. And he said, Smith, you're leaking fuel. And Dad hadn't even realized that. And at this point, the external fuel tanks had long since been expended. And they had 3 internal fuel tanks, and one was already gone. And he said, okay, I've got 15 minutes left on the second fuel tank, and then there's 1 more fuel tank left. There's no way I'm going to make it back to Ramitelli, but at least maybe I can make it to the Adriatic. So he's burning a gallon of fuel every minute. So within 15 minutes now, that second tank is going to be gone. And he said when he went to switch to the remaining fuel tank, it was like hitting a wall. And what happened was he wasn't leaking fuel, he was leaking engine coolant. And the P-51 Mustang was a liquid-cooled engine, and so you need that liquid to keep the engine cool. You don't have any engine coolant, and the engine's going to catch on fire. And so that's what happened. And the cockpit filled up with smoke, and the pilot says, Smith, you're on fire. You've got to bail out. And that typical nonchalant attitude of pilots. I know, guys, take care. I'll see you later. And so now Dad was in his predicament because now he's running out of fuel. His engine's malfunctioning, the cockpit's full of fire, he's going to have to bail out. And so the military protocol, unlike today, where you get to press a button and the ejection seat deploys and out you go, back then you actually had to pull the canopy back, and what you wanted to do was you actually had to turn the plane upside down, and then you would just let gravity take care of itself, and you would fall out. Well, how do you do that when a plane doesn't have an engine and has gone into a tailspin? And so now my dad is caught because the engine now is no longer working, cockpit's full of smoke, plane is no longer functioning, it starts to go into a tailspin. And my dad's trying to get out of the airplane. And the centrifugal force is pulling him out of the airplane, but it's in a spin, so he can't get it upside down to fall out. And so he's completely trapped. And he had placed his right foot between the brake and the rudder bar just to give him something to hold on to, because as you see, there's very little maneuverable room inside of a cockpit of P-51, and you're trying to get this plane upside down to fall out. It's in a tailspin, it's full of fire, etc. I mean, quite a catastrophic situation. Dad said to himself, so this is how things end. And
you know what he said to himself?
And he lost consciousness. But just before losing consciousness, he had the presence of mind. He had already unbuckled his safety harness belt to help him get out. He'd taken off the face mask. And he had the presence of mind to pull the ripcord of his parachute. And so the parachute was what pulled him out of this airplane that was in a tailspin. But it proceeded to turn his right foot, which had been wedged against the rudder and the brake pedal was turned 180 degrees around, and it snapped his hip in two. And so Dad regained consciousness, and as he regained consciousness, he could see on the ground his plane on fire, on the ground. He's coming down, he looks up, and he could see that he was actually coming down upside down. And all the shrouds of the parachute had been torn off, and so everything was just braced against his leg. And he's coming down upside down, and he could see that the center of the canopy of the parachute was torn. So now he's descending at far too fast a speed to be able to survive, and he's coming down upside down. And he blacked out a second time. And then when he regained consciousness, John, he said it was like his head was being slammed repeatedly against the wall. What was happening was he was crashing through the trees, and his head was repeatedly hitting the branches. But fortunate for him, there was just enough of parachute that caught the top of the trees, which suspended his fall. And so now he's in the trees. Now there was German military that had seen all this, and they're firing at him in the tree. So he's in the tree, fractured hip, his foot's turned 180 degrees around, and the Germans are shooting at him. Now Chubby Green, his wingman, who had created all this mess, actually landed his P-51 Mustang to try to rescue my dad. But the German military firing at Chubby Green, fortunate for Chubby Green, he was able to avoid being captured by the German military. And the Yugoslavia, and this is now over, they were over Yugoslavia where he actually parachuted out. The Yugoslav resistance actually picked up Chubby Green and eventually got him back to Italy safely. But now my father's in the tree and the Germans are firing at him. And after a few minutes, the Germans began to realize, he's not firing back. He must be really injured. So they climb up the tree, pull him out of the tree, bring him down. All they had was a donkey cart. They put him in a donkey cart. Now my dad's laying in a donkey cart, and he's got a broken hip. His foot's turned 100 degrees around. He's shaking uncontrollably just from all the stress that he had just gone through. And he's incredibly dehydrated, been in this burning plane, etc. And he's looking around and just all these unfriendly faces, to say the least. He's just turned 24. And he said he had three thoughts that went through his mind. Number one was, how did this happen? I flew 133 missions, how did this happen? Number two was, I just had written to my mom to tell her that I'd be coming home soon. I'm not going to be coming home soon. And based on what the faces that he's looking at, he's thinking, I may not be coming home ever.
Right.
And his third thought was, well, at least I won't have to go up tomorrow. So think about that. Think about that. That's sort of the stress. And he's thinking all this pain, more pain than you and I could ever imagine being in. 24 years old, thousands of miles away from home, surrounded by Germans and civilians, angry Germans, civilians, because the pilots were terrified of the civilians more than the military. The civilians, there was no control. And the civilians hated the pilots because the pilots were bombing their homes, et cetera. And many pilots were killed by civilians. And so there he is. And he's thinking, well, at least I won't have to go up tomorrow. So my dad spent the next 7 months in military as a prisoner of war. And initially, he was in a Stalag 17A, which is in Wolfsburg, Austria, which is where he was in prison.
Stalag 17?
Yeah, Stalag. And so the highest ranking POW in that camp was an Australian colonel who actually happened to be a medical doctor. And he took a particular interest in my father. He was one of the few pilots there and was the only African-American there. And he made a big stink with the Germans about, you need to take care of this pilot and make sure he survives. Now, my dad's in a full body cast, and he lost half his body weight while he was there, dropped to 70 pounds, and he didn't think he was going to live. And so the Germans actually put him into a civilian hospital because he was not a flight risk in a full body cast. And Dad's in this German hospital, and he had a roommate, and of course there's no Americans there, and everyone's speaking German. And he asked the roommate to help him learn how to speak German because he wanted to know what was going on. So after roughly 6 months, my dad actually asked to be put back into the POW camp. Because the reason being, Dad could hear the bombers going over every day, and he's thinking, this town, the town was named Spital, Austria. He said, this town's going to get bombed, and they don't know I'm here, and I'm going to die from friendly fire. So I want to go back to the POW camp. Those things said, fine, back to the POW camp you go. And so they go back to the camp, and so that camp was liberated in early May of 1945 by the British. When the British Army came in, they immediately wanted to address the needs of those POWs that were most injured. And so my dad was getting interviewed by a doctor and a nurse, and the doctor would ask questions. And my dad noticed every time my father was answering a question that the doctor had, the nurse was interpreting, was relaying essentially what he had said. He says, why is the nurse repeating everything that I'm saying? What he didn't realize, he was answering in German.
He didn't realize he was answering in German.
And the doctor said, oh, they'll be fine, Lieutenant. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. So he unfortunately had to spend the next 2 years recovering from his injuries. And as I had shared with you earlier, at the end of all those operations and 2 years of military hospitals, his right leg was 6 inches shorter than his left leg. And so he had to be retired from the military due to his combat injuries. So he went back to the University of Iowa, completed his degree, and then went on to become an aerospace engineer with General Electric. And he spent 38 years as an engineer with General Electric, and it'll be might of interest to you. In 1995, when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, President Clinton selected one member from each branch of the military to join him and Vice President Gore in all the official celebrations taking place in Europe. And President Clinton selected Dad, Luther Smith, to represent the Air Force.
Wow.
And so after that, Dad was on the so-called A-list, and he was frequently being invited down to the White House in the various ceremonies. So sort of at that point, then he began to talk about his experiences and his missions. And that's really when I started to learn more about what took place. And in the year 2000, my dad had been selected to be on the design committee for the World War II Memorial in Washington. So they had the groundbreaking ceremony in November of 2000. And Dad was the only World War II veteran who was invited to speak at the groundbreaking ceremony. And so the family was at the ceremony, and my father spoke, and then Clinton got up to speak. And I had watched Clinton during the time my dad was speaking. And during the time my dad was speaking, he spoke about his last mission. So this is on national TV, John. There's 10,000 people there at the National Mall for this groundbreaking ceremony. And I watched President Clinton. It was an unseasonably warm day. He had on a khaki suit, this Blues Brothers shades. And as Dad was speaking, I could see Clinton get on the edge of the seat. And he took off his shades, and he's intently listening to what my father had to say. And then after my father finished speaking, then President Clinton got up to speak. And he said, well, we're here today to honor what we refer to as the greatest generation, and the incredible sacrifices that these folks made. And so you just heard a little bit from Captain Smith. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about Captain Smith. So he spent the next minute and a half talking about my father. So it was quite something to hear the President of the United States talking about my father on national TV in front of 10,000 people. And so again, I share all this to kind of give you this whole arc about what they went through and what they were able to achieve and how nobody wanted them. And yet at the end, the white bomber crews didn't want to go on a mission without them. Sure. And as you're probably aware, in 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which opened up the U.S. Army, U.S. Military to no longer have segregated units. It would now be integrated. Right. And it'd be equal opportunities for all people regardless of race. And largely due to what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished. Because you can no longer say they can't work well with whites. You can no longer say they couldn't handle advanced military equipment. And the Tuskegee Airmen had completely shattered that. And so here is how that legend of the Tuskegee Airmen was created. This legacy that they created, resonates with us even today. And as my wife Nancy frequently reminds me, this isn't just American history or social history, military history. This is something that all of us can be inspired by and embrace as something that's just truly, truly remarkable and something that all of us can look up to with great joy and great pride. And in 1972, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen put together essentially like an alumni group. And that was really the first time they'd ever been referred to as the Tuskegee Airmen. Because before there was just the Negro pilots or the colored pilots, but as of 1972, they started to be referred to as the Tuskegee Airmen. And so they adopted a 6-point motto, which they feel represented their life. And that's to aim high, believe in yourself, use your brain, be ready to go, expect to win, and never give up.
Right.
And those are some incredible points that all of us can inspire to. And so that's the story of the legendary Tuskegee Airman.
It was fascinating to listen to for the time we spent. It was as good as I was expecting it to be.
Well, thank you.
Really quickly, tell me about the film and is it available?
Sure. So there, as you may know, there have been a couple of films on the Tuskegee Airmen. HBO did a film in 1995 starring Lawrence Fishburne called The Tuskegee Airmen. I actually had a chance to watch that with my father, and he said it was very accurate. It really followed the 1st Squadron, the 99th. Not too much aerial footage, but it really gave a good portrayal of sort of the obstacles and the challenges that they had to overcome. Then in 2013, you may be aware that George Lucas produced a film called The Red Tails. So a lot of aerial footage in that, kind of Hollywood. So those are kind of the 2 commercial films that have been out there. The Pennsylvania Veterans Museum put together a DVD called On Freedom's Way, Bound for Glory, that anyone can go on the Pennsylvania Veterans Museum website to obtain. They have incredible archival footage that was used to put together their DVD. The last 1/3 of the DVD actually focuses on my father. He talks a little bit more about his experiences. So for those listeners and viewers who want more detail, I would encourage them to get that DVD.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
John, my pleasure. Thank you so
very
much.
No, thank you for being a guest. Until next time, when we have another person of interest, I don't know, it'll be hard to top what we just did today. But this is John Ricciuti at Mainline TV. You can also find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I think that's about it. But thank you, and until next time, have a good day.